First story, by Sarah Thompson. I had always loved the charm of older houses, and my new apartment was no exception. It was a beautiful Victorian-era building with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows. My move was uneventful, and my neighbors seemed friendly enough. One neighbor in particular, Mr. Granger, lived right next door. He was an elderly man with a gentle smile, always offering a friendly wave whenever we crossed paths. It all began innocently enough. I started noticing that Mr. Granger had a peculiar habit. Every day, around noon, he would bring out a single chair and place it in his front yard, facing the street. He would sit there for hours, simply staring ahead with an unfocused gaze. At first, I thought it was just his way of enjoying the outdoors, but as days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was off. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to strike up a conversation with Mr. Granger as he sat in his chair. As I approached, I greeted him with a friendly smile, but he didn't acknowledge my presence. It was as if he was in a trance, lost in his own thoughts. I cleared my throat and tried again, this time speaking a little louder. Still, no response. His vacant stare sent shivers down my spine. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched whenever I was near my window. I often caught glimpses of Mr. Granger's figure, always positioned perfectly to have a direct line of sight into my apartment. It was unnerving, to say the least. I even started closing my curtains, hoping to regain some semblance of privacy. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I heard a soft knock on my door. When I opened it, Mr. Granger stood there, his smile more unsettling than ever. He held out a plate of homemade cookies. I hesitated, then thanked him and took the plate. As I closed the door, I noticed something odd. The cookies were arranged in a pattern, one that resembled the layout of our apartment complex. That night I couldn't sleep. The pattern of the cookies haunted my thoughts. I decided to do some research about Mr. Granger and the history of our building. It was then that I stumbled upon a news article from several decades ago. The article detailed a series of disappearances in the neighborhood, including Mr. Granger's wife, who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. The unsettling part? The article included a photo of Mr. Granger, and he looked exactly the same as he did now. As my paranoia grew, I became obsessed with understanding Mr. Granger's connection to these events. I started digging deeper, uncovering old police reports and talking to longtime residents of the neighborhood. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Mr. Granger was somehow involved. One night, unable to contain my curiosity any longer, I decided to confront Mr. Granger directly. I knocked on his door, heart pounding in my chest. He answered with his usual smile, but this time, his gaze was sharp and focused. I stammered out my questions, asking about his past and the disappearances. His smile never wavered as he invited me inside. What happened next was a whirlwind of revelations and terror. Mr. Granger revealed himself to be something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined, a being that had lived for centuries, preying on the lives of unsuspecting victims. As he recounted the tales of his past, I realized that he had lured me in, just as he had done with so many before. I barely managed to escape that night, my mind reeling from the horrors I had witnessed. I reported everything to the authorities, but by the time they arrived at Mr. Granger's house, he was gone. The house stood empty, devoid of any trace of his presence. To this day, I'm haunted by the memory of that encounter. I've moved far away from that neighborhood, but the feeling of being watched never truly leaves me. And every time I hear a creak in the floorboards or catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder if Mr. Granger has found me once again, continuing his centuries-old hunt for victims. Second story, by Anonymous. When I first moved into my new house on the outskirts of Atlanta, I was ecstatic. The neighborhood was exactly what I had been looking for: quiet, friendly, and safe. My excitement grew as I met my neighbors, all of whom welcomed me with open arms. Everyone, that is, except for Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts lived in the house right next door to mine. He was a tall man with a stern expression, and I could tell from the moment I met him that he wasn't thrilled about having a new neighbor. But I didn't let that deter me. I was determined to fit in and be a part of the community. It wasn't long, however, before I began to notice strange things about Mr. Roberts. He rarely left his house during the day, and whenever he did, it was always under the cover of darkness. He would step out in the dead of night, his figure illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. It gave me an eerie feeling, as if he was hiding something. One night, unable to resist my growing curiosity, I decided to watch Mr. Roberts from my window as he left his house. I saw him carrying a shovel, and my heart raced. What could he possibly be doing with a shovel in the middle of the night? My mind conjured up all sorts of terrifying scenarios, from burying bodies to participating in some sort of sinister ritual. The next morning, I convinced myself that I had simply let my imagination run wild. Maybe Mr. Roberts had a legitimate reason for being out so late. But as the days turned into weeks, his behavior only became more bizarre. He started leaving strange symbols on his doorstep, symbols that I couldn't decipher. And sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he would glance over at my house with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Mr. Roberts was somehow monitoring my every move. My anxiety grew to the point where I could hardly sleep at night. I started keeping my curtains closed at all times and avoided going outside after dark. The once welcoming neighborhood now felt like a prison, with Mr. Roberts as the warden. One evening, as I was returning home from work, I noticed a group of neighbors gathered on the street, all whispering and casting wary glances in the direction of Mr. Roberts' house. I joined the group, my heart pounding in my chest. Apparently, one of our neighbors had gone missing, the same neighbor who lived on the other side of Mr. Roberts. Rumors swirled through the neighborhood, and theories about Mr. Roberts' involvement grew more outlandish by the day. Some claimed he was a serial killer, while others believed he was part of a cult. The tension in the community was palpable, and fear hung in the air like a thick fog. One night, unable to bear the paranoia any longer, I decided to confront Mr. Roberts. I knocked on his door, my hands trembling. He opened it with a surprised expression, and I blurted out my questions about the symbols, his late-night activities, and the missing neighbor. To my surprise, he didn't seem angry or defensive. Instead, he sighed and invited me inside. What I discovered that night was both shocking and heartbreaking. Mr. Roberts wasn't a criminal or a cult member. He was a grieving father who had lost his daughter in a hit-and-run accident several years ago. The symbols he had been drawing were part of a ritual he had created to communicate with her spirit, and the late-night trips with the shovel were simply his way of visiting her grave. As I listened to his story, I realized the extent of my own paranoia and how I had unfairly judged him. The missing neighbor had simply moved away without informing anyone. The tension in the community was a product of fear and speculation, fueled by the unknown. In the end, I learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of letting our imaginations run wild and making snap judgments based on appearances. Mr. Roberts and I eventually became friends, and he shared stories of his daughter and the bond they had shared. The neighborhood slowly returned to its peaceful state, and I learned that sometimes the scariest things are the stories we tell ourselves. Third story, by Anonymous. Moving to Chicago had been a dream come true for my family. We found a charming house in a quiet neighborhood that seemed straight out of a storybook. The neighbors were friendly, the schools were great, and everything felt perfect. Little did we know, our picturesque life would take a chilling turn after meeting our new neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. Mrs. Patterson was an elderly woman who lived in the house right across the street from ours. She seemed harmless enough at first, always greeting us with a warm smile and homemade baked goods. But as the weeks went by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about her. One afternoon, as I was in the front yard with my kids, Mrs. Patterson approached us. She started making small talk, but her questions quickly turned invasive. She asked about our routines, when we left for work, and when our children came home from school. I brushed it off as simple curiosity, but a knot of unease settled in my stomach. As the days passed, Mrs. Patterson's behavior grew more concerning. She would often stand by her window, staring intently at our house for hours on end. Sometimes, when I glanced over, I would catch her gaze, and she would quickly avert her eyes. It was as if she was monitoring our every move. One night, I was woken up by the sound of soft scratching against our front door. Heart pounding, I crept downstairs and peered through the peephole, only to find Mrs. Patterson standing there, her gaze fixed on the door. I decided to ignore it, assuming it was a one-time occurrence fueled by my own paranoia. But the scratching persisted, night after night. I mentioned it to my husband, and he dismissed it as the result of neighborhood animals. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The scratching sounded deliberate, rhythmic, almost like a message. One morning, I found a note wedged under our doormat. It was from Mrs. Patterson, apologizing for the late-night disturbances and explaining that she had been experiencing sleepless nights due to a recent loss. She claimed the scratching was a result of her restless nights and begged for our understanding. Despite her explanation, I couldn't shake the fear that had settled in my gut. As weeks turned into months, Mrs. Patterson's behavior only grew more erratic. She began leaving strange trinkets on our doorstep, old photographs, wilted flowers, and even a lock of hair. Each item felt like a twisted puzzle piece, and I found myself becoming obsessed with deciphering their meaning. One evening, as I was researching local history at the library, I stumbled upon an old news article that sent shivers down my spine. The article detailed a series of unsolved disappearances in the neighborhood from decades ago. Among the missing was a young woman who had lived in Mrs. Patterson's house. The woman's face looked eerily familiar, and I realized she bore a striking resemblance to our neighbor. As my fear deepened, I decided to confront Mrs. Patterson. I knocked on her door, heart pounding, and she answered with a surprised expression. I delicately broached the topic of the disappearances and asked if she knew anything about them. Her face turned pale, and for a moment, I thought I had overstepped. But then she began to speak, her voice trembling. She admitted to being the missing woman's younger sister, and she revealed the chilling truth. Her sister had been involved in a dangerous cult that operated in the neighborhood. The cult had coerced her into their activities, and when she had tried to leave, they had silenced her. Mrs. Patterson's guilt had driven her to keep a watchful eye on the neighborhood, fearing that the cult might resurface. The scratching at our door had been her way of warning us, of trying to protect us from the same fate that had befallen her sister. In that moment, my perspective shifted. Mrs. Patterson wasn't a threat. She was a survivor haunted by her past. We shared stories, tears, and fears that night, and a bond formed between us that I never could have anticipated. The trinkets she had left were her way of reaching out, of seeking connection in a world that had once been filled with darkness. As time passed, Mrs. Patterson's behavior slowly returned to normal. The scratching ceased, and she started attending community events, opening up to the neighbors she had once observed from her window. Our neighborhood had weathered a storm of paranoia and fear, but in its aftermath, we had come together in unexpected ways, proving that sometimes, the most unsettling stories have the power to forge the strongest bonds. Thank you for watching whole video. Check this video on the screen, it's one of my favorite. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and smash that like, to support my free and daily content for you. If you enjoyed this video, drop a comment and tell me what story got you chills.